Hello everyone, welcome to the third module for evaluating the acceptability thresholds of quality traits for roots, tubers and bananas. In this module, we will explain how to carry out the hedonic tests for the RTB breeding project. This module was produced by Zoé DEUSCHER and revised by ADINSI Laurent and BUGAUD Christophe. If you wish to quote from this presentation, please use the reference at the bottom of this slide. First of all, it's important to remind you what a hedonic test, also known as a consumer test, is. The aim of a hedonic test is to measure the hedonic quality of a product, that is, the pleasure or satisfaction experienced when consuming a product on the basis of its sensory properties. The results of this test is valid at a given time, in a given place, and in a given context. The aim of a hedonic test is therefore to determine the appreciation and acceptability of products by consumers. To obtain these results, the test is carried out with around 100 naive consumers. They will evaluate the product overall and its various characteristics by answering questions. In this third module, I'm going to start by giving you two reminders of the previous modules. The first on the choice of products to be studied, and the second on the choice of sensory attributes. I will then explain how to develop the hedonic test questionnaire, then talk about the preparation of the test beforehand, then the practical organization of the test when it's carried out, and finally, I will briefly explain how to enter the results so that they can be processed later. This is the first reminder, the choice of product. This slide is a summary of what was explained in detail in Module 2. Before setting up your consumer test, you need to decide which product your study is going to focus on and how many different varieties. As a reminder, you must have a minimum of 6 contrasting samples in total. It's strongly recommended that you have more so that you can calculate the thresholds. Next, you need to interview a minimum of 100 consumers, bearing in mind that each consumer cannot test more than 6 products at a time. This is why you need to adapt your experimental plan according to the number of products you choose to study. Finally, you must absolutely use the same plant material to carry out your different analyses, in other words, the consumer test, the QDA analysis, and the physicochemical analysis. The second reminder concerns the choice of sensory attributes. The choice of attributes depends on the products you choose. Normally, the sensory attributes of the various products have been defined in the product profiles of the RTB food project. You will choose a maximum of 4 or 5 different attributes, and for each of them, you will need to establish a simple definition that can be understood by naive consumers. Now we come to the development part of the questionnaire. The questionnaire we recommend you carry out for the hedonic tests is in 3 parts. The first part concerns the question on overall liking of the product. The second part is the jar questions, just about right. These first 2 parts are repeated as many times as you have samples. In other words, if the consumer tests 4 samples, they will be asked the overall liking question 4 times and the same jar test question 4 times. Then, the third part of the questionnaire contains questions about consumers' personal information and consumption habits. These questionnaires are anonymous, and consumers are not asked to write their names on them. However, they are given a number, so there must be a questionnaire number for each consumer. I'm now going to give you a little more detail on the content of each part of the questionnaire. The first type of question in the questionnaire is the overall liking of the product. Consumers are asked to give a score on a scale of 1 to 10, corresponding to the overall appreciation of the product. It's important to specify what the different intensities on the scale correspond to. Score 1 is the lowest score, corresponding to I don't like it at all. A mark of 5 is neutral, and 9 is the highest mark, which means I like extremely the product. If you wish, you can adapt the scale to consumers. For example, you can use smileys, as in this example, so that people who cannot read properly can understand. The second part of the questionnaire is the JAR test. JAR stands for Just About Right. This test is used to test the consumer's level of satisfaction with different sensory attributes. Consumers are asked whether a sensory characteristic of a product, for example firmness, is too high, too low, or just about right for them. For this part of the questionnaire, it's important not to select more than 4 or 5 quality traits, so this amounts to having 4 or 5 JAR questions per sample. In the RTB Breeding project, we use a 3-point scale. One end of the scale is described as too low, the other as too high, and the middle point as just about right. The JAR test is very important because it will enable us to calculate the percentage of satisfied consumers for the different attributes, and this percentage will be used to determine the thresholds of acceptability. In a slightly more practical way, when the consumer arrives at this part of the questionnaire, you have to explain to them that for each sensory attribute, they have to say whether, according to what they are used to consuming, according to what they like, the attribute in question is too weak, just right, or too strong. For example, for the firmness of the plantain banana, you have to ask the consumer if, in relation to their ideal, the banana is not firm enough, in the mouth, too firm, or just the way they like it. Having completed the overall assessment of JAR question for all the samples, we now come to the final part of the questionnaire, which deals with the general questions to be asked of consumers. The first part of these questions concerns personal information, such as the consumer's gender, nationality, ethnic group, age, level of education or qualifications, personal situation, whether they are married, single or widowed, and their occupation. If you wish, you can consider other questions, such as their state of health or the composition of their household. The second part of the questions concern their consumption habits for the food you are studying. How often do they eat it? How do they eat it? When do they eat it? Etc. On this slide, you can see a summary of what I've just explained. It's an example of the different pages that make up the questionnaire. So each white rectangle represents a page of the questionnaire that you will present to the consumer. In this example, there are 3 different samples. The first page, which is not numbered, is an information and consent page. It can be 1 or 2 pages long, depending on the length of the project description. This page must be completed and signed by the consumer before starting the study. It will be kept separately from the questionnaire. Next, the questionnaire itself is presented in the 4 numbered page. The first 3 pages each correspond to the study of a sample. The first page contains some information that the consumer must fill in before receiving the samples to be tested: the date, the locality, and the name of the interviewer. On this page, it's very important that the interviewer has numbered the questionnaire before giving it to the consumer. Still on this first page, we find the questions for the overall liking and the JAR test concerning the first sample to be tested by the consumer. On the second page are the overall liking and JAR test questions for the second sample, and on the third page are the overall liking and JAR test questions for the third sample to be tested by the consumer. Finally, the fourth and last page contains the general questions, with a section on personal information and a section on consumption habits. In this example of a questionnaire, the consumer tasted the samples in order 1, then 2, then 3. But according to the experimental design you are going to do, not all consumers will taste the sample in this order. So some will taste the sample 2 on the first page, sample 3 on the second page, and the first sample on the third page, for example. When you assemble the different pages of your questionnaire, it will be up to you to put the pages in the testing order described in your experimental plan. You need to be particularly careful with the numbering of the samples in the questionnaires and make sure that the sample the consumer is testing corresponds to the one noted on the questionnaire. Once you have completed your consumer test questionnaire, you can prepare the rest of your consumer test. First of all, you will need to find a team for the day or days when you will be carrying out the test. This team will consist of a team leader, generally the person who initiated the test and drew up the questionnaire. You will then need a number of enumerators, 5 to 10 people, who may be students or colleagues, and who may also include the team leader. These people are really very important, as they will be responsible for welcoming the consumers, explaining the aim of the study, getting them to sign the consent forms, and explaining how the test will be run, the content of the questionnaire, and the definition of the sensory attributes. They will also have to take the samples to the consumers as the study progresses and thank them at the end. Next, you will need a cook if the product is to be eaten cooked or hot. If the product is to be consumed cold and can be cooked the day before the study and kept in the fridge, it's possible that the cooks will be the same people as the enumerators. Once the test has been completed and the data collected, you can arrange for a few people to enter the data into an Excel spreadsheet. It's also possible to do it alone. It will just take longer. Once you have a team, you can assemble the necessary equipment for the consumer test. First of all, you will need to choose a place to carry out the test, which could be in the street, near a market, in a restaurant, and so on. You will need tables and chairs so the consumers can sit down during the test, as well as tables on which to place the equipment and samples. For the test, you will of course need your samples ready to be consumed, which can be kept in coolers if they need to be kept hot or cold. Then you will need the equipment to eat the samples, including cutlery, plates, or bowls in which to put the samples and napkin. Don't forget to take markers with you to write the codes for the samples on the bowls and plates. You will also need to bring cups and drinking water so the consumers can drink between samples. Of course, you will need questionnaires, but also consent form and list of definitions. Don't forget to bring bins for food leftovers and other rubbish. And finally, plan a small gift to give to consumers to thank them for the participation. This could be a small bar of soap, a drink, a sweet, etc. To validate your questionnaire and train the team of interviewers, you can carry out a pretest. To do this, you organize a consumer test under the same conditions as the real test, the only difference being that you do it in a different place. During this pretest, you will only question a few consumers. This pretest is used to check that the questionnaire is understandable to consumers and also to train the team. At the end of this pretest, it will be possible to modify the questionnaire if you notice that some of the questions are not clear. This pretest stage is not compulsory, but it is recommended, especially if you have never carried out a consumer test before. We now move on the more practical part of the test. On the day you carry out the consumer test, you will need to set up the tables before welcoming the consumers. In this photo, you can see the essentials of what needs to be put on the table. Firstly, the various paper documents, including the list of definition of the sensory descriptors, the consent form, and the information sheet describing the project. And finally, the questionnaire. Then you need to add a glass with water, a fork or spoon to be able to eat the product, a napkin, and a pen. There is also the option to add a little extra when you're doing the tests. It's a small sign with the code for the sample numbers. When consumers are able to answer the questionnaires on their own, They can ask for the next sample to be brought to them by simply raising the sign with the number of samples they need. This way, the interviewer will know which sample they need and can bring it to them. On the day of the consumer test, you will need to set up all the equipment before the consumers arrive and brief your team so that everyone knows their role. When the consumer arrives, the interviewer has to welcome them and sit them at a table that's already been set up with all the elements I've shown you before. The interviewer must then explain the purpose of the study to the consumer and the consent procedure and get them to sign the consent form. The interviewer can then explain the different stages of the test, the questions in the questionnaire in detail, and the definitions of the sensory attributes. The explanation should preferably be given in the consumer's language. The consumer must carry out all the tests in the questionnaire, overall liking and jar tests, on one product before moving to the second product and so on. The consumer must test each product in the order indicated on the questionnaire, one after the other, until all the products have been tested. If the consumer is unable to answer the questions alone, the enumerator must remain at the consumer's side for the duration of the test and record the consumer's answers. But even if the interviewer is present, he or she must never influence the consumer's judgment or assessments. When the consumer has finished analyzing the various products, the enumerators thank them and offer them a small gift. And when the consumer has left, the table is cleared, the completed questionnaire is put away, and the table is again prepared to welcome the next consumer. When the consumer test is finished and you have questioned enough consumers, you need to enter the data from the questionnaires into an Excel table. For the overall liking data, you enter the score from 1 to 9 given by the consumers. For the jar test, you will use this notation. When the consumer says that it's not enough, you will enter the value 1. When it's just about right, it will be the note 2. And when it's too intense, it will be the note 3. Here is an example of the table structure you can use. You will have one row per consumer. The first columns will be for overall liking and the jar tests for different attributes of one sample. Then the next columns will be about the overall liking and the jar test of the following samples, and so on. The last columns on your table, which are not shown here, will be used to enter the general data. This slide shows you how to group the results from the jar test. This is a fictitious example of the results that can be obtained from a consumer test. The table in green is the same as the one shown on the previous slide. From this table, we can group the jar test data by sample. This is what you can see in the second table in gray. The rows show all the consumers. The first column shows the sample number. Here we start with sample number 1. And the following columns show the scores corresponding to the jar test results for the different sensory attributes. From this table, for each sample and each sensory attribute, you can calculate the percentage of consumers who declared the attribute to be not enough, just right, or too intense. From this gray table, it's possible to extract the data by descriptor in a new table shown in yellow. Here is the example for firmness. In sample 1, we find 16% of consumers who found the sample not firm enough, 54% who found it just right, and 30% who found it too firm. Constructing this type of table will then be useful for calculating acceptability thresholds. This brings us to the end of our presentation on hedonic tests. This type of test will enable you to obtain a mean overall liking score for each product, as well as segmenting consumers into groups with similar acceptance patterns for the products using a hierarchical classification. Thanks to the hedonic test, you can determine the optimum level of intensity of certain sensory characteristics of products using a jar scale. These results will then be useful in determining acceptability thresholds. The more general questions at the end of the questionnaire will give you an inventory of consumers' consumption habits. Finally, here is a quick summary of the key points to remember when carrying out this type of tests. At least 100 naive, untrained consumers should be interviewed. It's best to do the test in one place at a time. It's a test you can carry out outdoors, so you don't need to do it in a laboratory and call people in. To be able to carry out this study, you need some equipment and an available team. Remember not to test more than 6 samples per consumer and to test only 4 or 5 sensory attributes in the jar test section. Finally, the questionnaire will be made up of 3 types of questions: the overall liking, the jar test, and the general questions. Thank you for following the third module and have a good day. See you soon. Bye.